Chapter 2. A Fateful Interview. Well before the Rolls-Royce was due to arrive at the Jones salvage yard the following morning, Pete and Jupiter were standing outside the big iron gates waiting. They both wore their Sunday suits, with white shirts and neckties. Their hair was plastered into place and their faces glowed pink through their normal tan. Even their fingernails glowed from the application of a stiff brush. But when at last the big car arrived, its gleam far outshone theirs. It was a Rolls-Royce of rather ancient vintage, with huge headlights like snare drums and a tremendously long hood. The body was square and box-like, but all the trimming, even the bumpers, was gold-plated, and it gleamed like jewellery. The black body shone with such a deep lustre it was almost a mirror. "Golly," Pete said reverently as the car came towards them. "It looks like a car a billionaire 110 years old would ride in." "The Rolls-Royce is the most expensive regular production model car in the world," Jupiter said. "This one was originally built for a rich Arabian sheik of luxurious tastes. Now the company uses it mostly for publicity purposes." The car came to a stop, and the chauffeur whipped out of the front seat. He was a lean, powerfully built man more than 6 feet tall, with a long, good-humoured face. He removed his chauffeur's cap and addressed Jupiter. "Master Jones," he said, "I am Worthington, the chauffeur." "Ah, glad to meet you, Mr. Worthington," Jupiter said. "But call me Jupiter, like everybody else." "Please, sir," Worthington looked pained. "You must address me simply as Worthington. That is customary. It is also customary for me to address my employers in a somewhat formal manner. You are now my employer, as it were, and I would prefer to adhere to custom." "Well, all right, Worthington," Jupiter said, "if it's customary." "Thank you, sir. Now the car and I are at your service for 30 days. 30 days of 24 hours each," Jupiter said. "That's how the contest rules were worded." "Precisely, sir." Worthington opened the rear door. "Will you enter?" "Thank you," Jupiter said, as he and his partner clambered in. "But you don't have to open doors for us. We're young enough to do that for ourselves." "If you don't mind, sir," Worthington answered. "I would prefer to render every service I'm supposed to. If I don't, I might get slack in the future." "I see." Jupiter mulled that over as Worthington took his place behind the wheel. "But we may want to get in or out in a hurry sometimes, Worthington. We might not be able to wait for you. Suppose we get in and out by ourselves except at the beginning and ending of a trip." "Very good, sir." In the rearview mirror they could see the British chauffeur smiling. "A very neat solution." We probably won't be as dignified as most of the people you've driven around," Jupiter confided. "And we may want to go to some unusual spots. This will help explain." He handed one of the 3 investigators' business cards to Worthington, who studied it gravely. "I believe I understand, sir," Worthington said. "I am quite looking forward to this assignment. It will be a change to drive someone young and adventurous. Most of my passengers have been rather elderly and cautious. Now our first destination, sir?" Pete and Jupiter found themselves taking a great liking to the chauffeur. "We want to go to World Studios in Hollywood, to call on Mr. Alfred Hitchcock," Jupiter said. I telephoned him yesterday." "Very good, Master Jones." A moment later, the luxurious car was purring up the road that led over the hills towards Hollywood. Worthington spoke over his shoulder. "I should inform you that this car has a telephone and a refreshment compartment, both of which are at your service." "Thank you," Jupiter said, already acting dignified, as befitted the occupant of such a car. Reaching in front of him, he opened a compartment and lifted out a telephone. Like the trimming on the car, it was gold-plated. It had no dial, however, just a button to be pushed. "A mobile telephone," he informed Pete. "One pushes the button and gives the desired number to the operator. I don't think we have any need for it just yet, however." Somewhat reluctantly, Jupiter put the phone away again and settled back against the leather upholstery. The drive was pleasant but uneventful, and soon they were riding through the business section of Hollywood. As they drew nearer their destination, Pete began to squirm uneasily on the seat. "Jupe," he said, "I wish you'd tell me how we're ever going to get through the studio gate. You know perfectly well all studios have walls and gatemen just to keep out people like us. We'll never get inside." "I have a strategy in mind," Jupiter said. "I only hope it will work, for we seem to have arrived." They were driving past high stucco walls that extended for 2 full blocks. A sign on top said, "World Studios." The wall was there for just one reason, to keep people out, as Pete had said. In the centre was a tall iron gate that stood open. A man in uniform sat in a small cubbyhole beside it. Worthington swung the rolls into the driveway, and the guard jumped up. "Hey, wait a minute," he yelled. "Where are you going?" Worthington stopped the car. "We are calling on Mr. Alfred Hitchcock." "You have a pass?" the guard asked. "We did not expect to need a pass," Worthington replied. "The master telephoned Mr. Hitchcock." Which was perfectly true, of course, even if Mr. Hitchcock hadn't answered. "Oh?" The guard scratched his head uncertainly. Jupiter lowered the window on his side and leaned out. "My good man," he said, and Pete almost jumped because Jupe was speaking in a rich English accent he had never used before but must have practiced in secret. "My good man, what seems to be the delay?" "Gleeps," Pete whispered to himself. He knew that Jupe had been an actor in television when he was just a tiny kid, and he had a real talent for impersonations, but Pete had never seen him do this one before. By puffing out his cheeks and lips a bit and looking down his nose, Jupe had turned into a dead ringer for Alfred Hitchcock himself. A rather impertinent young Alfred Hitchcock, of course, but nobody could miss the resemblance. I have to know who's calling on Mr. Hitchcock," the guard said nervously. "I see." Jupiter gave him another down-the-nose look. "Perhaps I had better phone my uncle." He took out the gold-plated telephone, pressed the button, and asked for a number. It was the number of the Jones salvage yard. Jupiter was really calling his uncle. The guard took one more look at the amazing car and at Jupiter Jones using the gold telephone. You just go on in," the guard said hurriedly. "I'll phone you're on your way." "Thank you," Jupiter said. "Drive on, Worthington." The car moved on. Jupiter settled back as they turned down a narrow street bordered on both sides by green lawns and palm trees, with dozens of small, attractive bungalows set close together among them. Farther on were the arched roofs of the big studios where movies and television films were made. Actors in costumes were filing towards one of them. Although the car was now inside the studio, Pete still couldn't figure how even his partner could get in to see Mr. Hitchcock. But he had little time to worry, for Worthington was already pulling up beside a large bungalow. As was customary in many studios, each producer had a bungalow of his own where he could work without being disturbed. A neatly painted sign said, "Alfred Hitchcock." "Wait for us, Worthington," Jupiter said as the chauffeur opened the door. "I don't know how long we'll be." "Very good, sir." Jupe led the way up the one step and through the screen door into the air-cooled reception room. A blonde girl behind a desk was just putting down the phone. Pete had trouble recognizing the grown-up Henrietta Larson, but as soon as she spoke, he knew her. "So," Henrietta put her hands on her hips and looked at Jupiter Jones. "You're here, are you? Impersonating Mr. Hitchcock's nephew? Well, now we'll see just how long it takes the studio police to get rid of you." Pete's heart sank to his socks as she reached for the telephone again. "Wait," Jupiter said. "Wait for what?" Henrietta Larson asked scornfully. "You got in here by telling the guard at the gate you're Mr. Hitchcock's nephew." "No, he didn't," Pete defended his partner. "The guard just jumped to conclusions." You keep out of this, Henrietta warned Pete. Jupiter Jones is a public nuisance and I'm going to see he's taken care of. She bent over the telephone again. Jupiter spoke once more. It is never wise to act hastily, Miss Larson, he said, and Pete jumped. Jupiter was using that rich English voice again, and in the space of a moment he had returned to the appearance which had so impressed the gateman, the appearance of a very youthful Alfred Hitchcock. I feel sure Mr. Hitchcock would be interested in seeing this display of my acting talents, Jupiter finished. Henrietta Larson, looking up, dropped the telephone as if it had stung her. Why, you, she began, you... For a moment, words seemed to fail her. Then her face became grim. Yes, indeed, Jupiter Jones. I'm positive Mr. Hitchcock will want to see this display. Ahem. Miss Larson. Both boys hastily turned at the unexpected sound of a voice behind them. Even Henrietta appeared startled. There in the office door stood Alfred Hitchcock himself. Is there something wrong, Miss Larson? Mr. Hitchcock asked. I've been ringing for you. It's for you to decide if there's anything wrong, Mr. Hitchcock, Henrietta Larson said. This young man has something to show you in which I'm sure you will be very interested. I'm sorry, Mr. Hitchcock said. I can't see anyone today. Send him away. I'm positive you'll want to see this, Mr. Hitchcock, Henrietta Larson said, and there was a tone in her voice Pete did not like at all. Mr. Hitchcock caught it too, for he looked quizzically at the two boys, then shrugged. Very well, follow me, lads. He turned and strode to a desk the size of a tennis court. There he sat down in a swivel chair. Jupiter and Pete stood facing him as Henrietta shut the door. Now, boys, Mr. Hitchcock said, what is it that I'm supposed to see? I can spare you only 5 minutes. This is what I wanted to show you, sir, Jupiter said respectfully and whipped out one of the 3 investigators' business cards. Pete realised that Jupiter was following some plan of strategy that he had previously concocted. Apparently it was working. Mr. Hitchcock took the card and studied it. He said. So you are investigators. May I ask what the question marks are for? Do they indicate a doubt in your own ability? No, sir, Jupiter answered. They are our trademark. They are symbolical of questions to be answered, of mysteries to be solved. Also, they make people ask questions, and that helps them remember us. I see, Mr. Hitchcock gave a little cough. You are publicity-minded. A business can't succeed if people don't know about it, Jupiter said. A statement which cannot be disputed, Mr. Hitchcock agreed. But speaking of business, you have not yet stated yours. We want to find a haunted house for you, sir. A haunted house? Alfred Hitchcock's eyebrows rose. What makes you think I want a haunted house? We understand you want to find an authentic haunted house to use in your next suspense picture, sir, Jupiter said. The 3 investigators desire to assist you in the search. Alfred Hitchcock chuckled. I have 2 location scouts searching for a proper house at this moment, he said. One is in Salem, Massachusetts, and the other in Charleston, South Carolina. Both places are rich in supernatural lore. Tomorrow the 2 men will go to Boston and New Orleans. I'm sure they'll find me the right house for my purposes. But if we could find you the right house here in California, it would be a lot simpler to make your picture here, sir, Jupiter argued. I am sorry, my lad. It is out of the question. We don't want any money, sir, Jupiter said. But all famous detectives have someone write up their cases for people to read. Sherlock Holmes, Ellery Queen, Hercule Poirot, all of them. I have deduced that this is how they become famous. In order to get potential customers to know about the 3 investigators, we'll have our cases written up by the father of our other partner, Bob Andrews. He works for a newspaper. Well, Alfred Hitchcock looked at his watch. Well, Mr. Hitchcock, I thought if you could just introduce our first case. quite impossible. Please ask Miss Larson to come in on your way out." "Yes, sir." Jupiter looked depressed as he and Pete turned towards the door. They had almost reached it when Alfred Hitchcock spoke. "One moment, lads." "Yes, sir?" They turned. Mr. Hitchcock was looking at them with a frown. "It occurs to me that you have not been entirely frank. What exactly was it that Miss Larson thought I should see? Not your business card, I'm sure." "Well, sir," Jupiter said reluctantly, "I can do various impersonations, and she thought you would want to see my impersonation of you as a boy." "Impersonation of me as a boy?" The famous director's voice grew deeper. His features clouded. "Just what do you mean?" "This, sir." And once again Jupiter's face seemed to change shape. His voice deepened and took on an English accent, and he became a different individual. "It occurred to me, Mr. Hitchcock," he said in a voice entirely different from his own, "that some day you might wish to have someone portray you as a boy in a motion picture, and if you did—" Mr. Hitchcock's brow had wrinkled. His face was dark with displeasure. "Monstrous," he said. "Stop it at once." Jupiter resumed his own identity. "You don't think it's a good likeness?" he asked. "I mean, of you when you were a boy?" "Certainly not. In any case, I was a fine, upstanding lad. Not at all like that gross caricature you just attempted." "Then I guess I'll have to practice some more," Jupiter sighed. "My friends thought it was very good." "I forbid it," Alfred Hitchcock thundered. "I absolutely forbid it. Give me your promise never again to do that particular impersonation, and confound it, I'll introduce whatever you write about your case." "Thank you, Mr. Hitchcock," Jupiter said. "Then you want us to investigate the haunted house situation for you?" "Oh, yes, I suppose so. I don't promise to use it even if you find it, but investigate by all means. Now get out of here before I lose my last vestige of self-control. I take very dim view of lads such as you. You are entirely too clever for your own good, young man." Jupiter and Pete raced out towards the car, leaving Alfred Hitchcock looking darkly thoughtful as they went.